Hello, everybody. I have the great good fortune today of having Professor Dan Kammen from UC Berkeley here with me today, and it is the 22nd of November. Dan, how you doing? What's going on out there?
I'm doing well. We are experiencing an atmospheric river. So we have all kinds of trees flying around and trash cans and fall leaves all swirling out there right now.
Gotcha. So how much rain have you had today?
Not much, but it's threatening, to put it mildly.
And California's had quite a few years of good rain over the last few years, yes?
The cycles have been good to us, in particular, low on fires for this particular season. So everyone's very thankful for that.
So Dan, tell us a little bit about you, please.
So I'm a physicist by training, which I guess we all have interesting paths to these various topics. I grew up thinking I were wanting to be an astronaut and did a number of things on that pathway, physics major, getting my pilot's license, taking aerobatic lessons, and then was derailed because I failed the vision test at one step of the game on the path to NASA. And so pivoted into energy and development issues by working in Nicaragua and traversing a lot of Central America, and was able to parlay my physics and kind of what we would call today data science and machine learning and AI background into energy systems. And I've been a professor first at Princeton and now at Berkeley now for 30 years on these topics. So work on climate change, energy and poor communities, the justice aspects, who has access to resources, who doesn't. I run a wonderful lab group, and I've served in two different U.S. federal administrations, both the Biden and the Obama administrations before that, as well as having stops at the World Bank and elsewhere. So I've been really privileged to get to work on topics that I think really matter a lot. And on the way on that path, I got to meet you and your family, and that has been a big impact on what my students can get to do and topics we've talked about as well. So it's been a lot of fun. And it's been a lot of fun getting to know you during this journey as well.
Thank you, Dan. So I want to take you back a little bit to when you were a young little kid. And what were you
I
like?
must say I'm
Like,
still there, but we'll leave
well,
that for later.
I was going to let you say that, not me. But Dan, what were you like as a kid?
I fear I was probably the world's most stereotypical nerd. I definitely thought that my schedule revolved mainly around Star Trek and around the worldviews that you can contemplate in Star Trek. I think that a game that I played as a kid with was insufferable with my friends is in how few words can you identify a Star Trek episode? And that maybe framed the group of us that did astronomy and got excited about physics and chemistry experiments and working with our Boy Scout troop leader to try to raise money to build a planetarium in the small town of Ithaca, New York. All of those things kind of have a theme running through them. And maybe the most embarrassing, but maybe the most accurate of all is when I was in Cub Scouts, I managed to insist that our Cub Scout group be called the Einsteinians. And so from Cub Scout to Boy Scout, well, I was in Troop 1, the Einsteinians of Ithaca, New York. So I definitely think that the theme was pretty solidly consistent.
Well, and so were you a typical kid in the sense like you liked to run around outside and get wild and crazy? And, did you have a group of kids you ran around with, or were you really kind of more inside and inside the lab, so to speak, early on?
No inside the lab at all. So even though I grew up a stone's throw from Cornell University in some great labs, I also grew up on the edge of what was called 6 Mile Creek. It was a lot longer than 6 miles, but it meant that we had infinite woods. And so after school, all weekends was spent exploring far, far into the woods, building forts, building the deck of the Starship Enterprise out of old timber in various spots, plotting astronomy weekends, getting a telescope at an early age, lots of things that wrapped into that kind of mindset that was both about science and excitement about nature, but it was really out in nature basically every day.
And what was the fascination with the stars? Like, what was that all about for you?
I really think I'd like to tell a more complicated story, but I think it really came from just loving the Star Trek world from an early age. And that got one excited about the science of Star Trek. There's actually now been books written, like The Physics of Star Trek is a real thing. That's a book that exists out there by someone who I went to graduate school with. And so I think that those things just kind of melded together. It was fun to play on your bicycle, and there was a huge bike loop, an 88-mile loop that we would sometimes do later in years in high school around Cayuga Lake. But it really kind of set up for this excitement and fun, not only about appreciating nature, but also about really enjoying getting to understand how and why things work.
And so that shows the power of media and its ability to influence young minds and hearts, so to speak, and really allow that passion to emerge in young people. So, and it was that, did you just watch Star Trek, or were you reading books about Star Trek at that time, or?
Well, actually, it was all science fiction. Two friends of mine and myself and their brothers and sisters would, when we weren't running around in the woods, we would all kind of be flopped into one of a kind of a 3-person bedroom in a friend's house, all reading Asimov, Larry Niven, Heinlein, all the kind of science fictions. Um, it was a big mix in our heads. It was certainly media, but it was back then it was these novels of the great science fiction masters that I think we spent most of our time doing. And I still have some of those books to this day. So back when books
Gotcha.
were
And
99 cents, and we all kind of went down to the local Woolworths and found the used science fiction books and brought back armloads full. So
well, Woolworths, that certainly dates you.
it sure does.
So, Dan, do you find today that the students are also influenced by Star Trek and science fiction? That I know you're not teaching astronomy and things like that, but are the students of today, influenced by Star Trek, or what are they influenced by actually in their thinking?
Well, it's an episode in itself, but I mean, I do teach a very large undergraduate class called Energy and Society, 200 plus undergraduates and 100 graduate students all in the same lecture, different exams, different problem sets, but it's a very different world now because there were so few media outlets. There was only a small number of TV channels, couple different radio series, especially in a small town like Ithaca, very different. So I wish that the mentality of Star Trek had a bigger place today, because it is about a world, about a future where money is not important, and bettering yourself for yourself and for your community are all kind of the underlying themes. Diversity all play a key role. I feel like a lot of the bombarded messages that kids get today, by kids, I mean my own kids, high school, college, and my students, is very individualistic. How do you look? How do you appear in this situation? It's less about this kind of collective good that I always kind of felt was one of the themes of us running around in the woods. And I don't envy at all the complex world that kids have to grow up in today, where essentially even the most embarrassing things that you ever say or do are recorded forever, and you can be called out on anything you even thought briefly, because thoughts go directly onto digital media today, and that was not the case. So there's a lot of things that I wish kids today did differently, but I also really feel that they face challenges too early, and challenges that we didn't even envision at the time that I was kind of living that.
So our audience is young parents, a lot of them, and they're faced with these challenges, and that's why we created Global Galactics, is we wanted to provide content that was rich and engaging and supportive of a whole child. How would you counsel parents, if you were able to, with young children, about how to manage all of these opportunities and challenges that we're facing today?
Well, I mean, let me start with some of the big obvious ones, but that's a long list. And so, one of the issues right off that everyone has to face, and, there may be some really good practical reasons why kids get cell phones at early ages, safe pickup from school, knowing where people are, etc. But it's pretty clear now that at the point that a child gets access to a cell phone that is primarily theirs, you've already made a really critical choice that a lot of people think about it in detail, but others, it's a little more logistically, I need to do this, but it shapes how kids interact with the world, again, in ways that at minimum, it's too early to have your evolving thoughts essentially tagged to you for all time. And so I think that's one of the challenges right off. The other one that I'll tell a story in terms of my students, and it's both the evolving understanding of mental health that we either didn't have largely when I was a kid, or we just ignored because it was convenient to ignore it. But while I've been teaching at Berkeley, so now 25 years, early on, one or two kids in the class had reasons why they needed dispensations on exams. They needed more time. They needed a quiet environment. They needed a stand-up situation to take tests, whatever the dispensation would be. And there were very few of them, far fewer that actually needed it, advocated for themselves to get it. So we were far too dismissive of mental health when I started teaching and when I was a kid. And now, 25 or 30 or more percent of my class, this is a couple hundred kids, all have different dispensations. And so there's a complicated world that parents now need to navigate. And we need to be much more aware and thoughtful about learning differences and understanding different evolutionary pathways, gender fluidity, all kinds of things are part of that. Other side is that I see a lot of kids who, for lack of a better word, are challenged when it comes to grit, meaning the ability to say, this is something I want to get good at: basketball, physics, astronomy, painting, music, whatever else. And if it doesn't come easily or quickly enough, the stick-to-itness is hard. And grit is often the term used to encapsulate a lot of things. And that doesn't mean you should suffer. But what it does mean is that, finding your passion, getting interested in things is very different now because we didn't have a lot of media angles. So if I felt like I wanted to understand astronomy, astrophysics, because I got inspired by these great early science fiction writers and series, you kind of then had to dig in. And now with social media so present, whenever you see something that is of interest, you can see people right away who appear to be incredibly good at it, maybe too good at it in some cases. And so this continuum between how do we support and reflect differences in styles of learning behavior, social behavior of our children, and this need to really dig in and say, I want to learn what this is like. I don't mean a profession. I mean, I want to understand what it takes to get my karate skills better, or my painting, or for me, basketball. What does it take? And I think this is really the area of challenge that for me as a parent, and I think for a lot of parents, is the hardest one. You want to encourage exploration. You want to get people thinking and finding their interests and their passions. But you also want people to make some choices and stick with it, even if it doesn't come easy in the beginning. And you can always find an example on YouTube or TikTok where it seems like it came really easy to someone, and that's just not always the case.
So as a parent, again, coming back to our listeners, what can parents do from your vantage point to help their children develop grit, to help them find not only their passion, but find the discipline and the commitment to going for it, so to speak? Because
So
I know that
as a
a lot of
professor,
parents
right?
want
Yeah,
that.
neat question. So I mean, as a professor, I don't want to I don't want to overprescribe, because certainly it can sound like, oh well, if you're interested in something, if you spend your 10,000 hours, your 20,000 hours, walk your 10,000 steps, you're going to get there. And that's way too linear and way too simplistic. But I do think that in each family setting, in each kind of context, the mixture of encouraging exploration and there's a value in learning how to do things. Well, in teaching, we say what the most important thing you learn in school is not the subject, it's how to learn. And that means not everything comes easy. And often the first pass can be exciting, but it's not enough. And so you need to, again, to develop that stick to itness, but also recognize that you're not making like life career choices at age 3, 9, 10, 18, 20. And so that balance, I think, really comes out of, the nurturing context that you do for kids. I definitely can think of examples when I felt like we, in our house, encouraged our kids to do exciting things, but then when they wanted to change, maybe let them make the change too easily, as opposed to saying, you committed to this. Let's take it a little further. And, you might not love all the stages, learning certain instruments, learning computer coding, deciding you want to get better at drawing or a sport. That balance, I do think, comes from your context. And I think it's maybe the most important and the most challenging, especially in how fast we are either encouraging or being permissive in letting our kids grow up. And I felt like I had all the time in the world. You can play and you can then decide, I'm going to do a lot of bike riding, or I'm going to, understand the gears on bikes or motorcycles. And if I moved on from that, it was fine, but I put and thought in and I learned how to learn. And I think that's the hardest balance right now.
All right. So learning how to learn is really important, and helping your children discover that for themselves and how they learn best is really important. And what about awe, like the concept of awe and wonder, which I know is important at Berkeley because there's a center on awe. But what about helping your child discover that awe? Because some kids seem to come out with it. They've got it. They're born with it. And that's how they exist. Other kids, less so. And I'm sure you're constantly playing that, even with yourself as a professor to college age kids. But let's talk about awe and the existence of awe. It's clearly you had it as a child. Clearly, you were given these playgrounds to explore and discover. And I certainly was. I had a lot of that in my life. I lived in nature. I could access Star Trek and all kinds of amazing, inventive shows that inspired and encouraged me. And my parents constantly gave me that encouragement as well. But how do we help children develop that awe and that wonder and that all of that?
So there's a couple different threads in that get woven together in, kind of the idyllic view that parents, when they're able, encourage their kids to be explorers and to find things they want to, whether it's internal or external, but they find areas to dig into and learn about themselves and learn about the world through. That's an awe feature. And certainly, I felt like I had it. There's also a really critical issue about privilege in that too, because many settings don't have the same flexibility, because whether it's financial or racial or a whole variety of things that make those choices different based on where you are. And so I think one aspect that you can find awe in anything. It doesn't mean that you have to have a beautiful river next to your house to see the awe of nature. You can do this internally, but circumstance and the degree to which we now very clearly see, whether we act on it's a different story, but we very clearly see the degree to which we as a society discriminate. And we discriminate against those that are unlike ourselves in many ways. And so the idea that, the US or some other countries are kind of melting pots, not just of different cultures, but of equal access, is something that we didn't question a whole lot. My parents at civil rights drive to civil rights rallies thought about it, but we've learned a lot through the Me Too movement, through the issues around George Floyd, the issues that many of the things that we use to make access in higher education. Standardized test scores, for example. Standardized test scores clearly mainly test for how rich you are, not about how interesting or creative or awe-inspired you are. So we have a lot of unlearning and deconstructing institutions that make that kind of joyful, awe-inspiring path you described available to the affluent. And that's a
So
key.
how do we create all opportunities for those who don't have those benefits per se by place or opportunity? What allows all to exist? What allows all to be cultivated?
Well, I think there's a couple. I mean, obviously there's a lot of features, but a few of them that clearly work is that access to mentors, access to information that you might not normally come across, and encouragement is a big deal. And whether that's parents, after school groups, university professors, I certainly feel like the most important thing that I do in lecture is not a given equation or a given passage of text. It's to demonstrate that I'm really excited about what I'm doing. And whether it's a college first-year student, we used to call them freshmen, now first year, or whether it's someone very late in their graduate career. So what I'm most pleased with is that I get to teach a class where all of those people are in the same lecture hall. Someone very late in their career, they're actually already thinking about applying to faculty jobs, or they're applying for jobs in industry or government, in the same room with people who this is their first university experience. And to my mind, that's one of the most awe-inspiring features, because it kind of shows people across a pretty big part of the spectrum that the learning opportunities are about what are available, but also what you create by being excited in things. And in fact, I give almost the same lecture with a few less equations when I go teach at local area high schools, and when I served on the school board of our kids' local school. So I think there's a lot of ways to provide that. I also think that this challenge of this media-centric society makes it hard, because it seems like everything is out there, and it seems like that there's someone who is amazingly good at whatever you show any interest in, and the hard work or the interesting work, maybe hard work is the wrong term, but the interesting journey doesn't appear when we boil things down to 180 character messages or 20-second TikToks. That gets away from the thing that empowers you, and that is learning is a journey. It's not this destination. It's not a grade. It's a process. And that's something
So
that
that
we make less available to those who are less entitled.
so that's something then that sounds like we need to focus on is how do we encourage, inspire, lead with that learning is a journey. Learning is something that can be awesome in its own right for yourself. So I want to move the conversation to dogs, since you and I both share a passion for dogs. And you knew Sparky. You were a great fan of Sparks, and he loved you very much. And so tell me about, dogs and that connecting to the awe and the awesomeness of existence, because dogs seem to almost lead with that. A lot of dogs, they have that in them. And I think humans are really attracted to that. Kids are really attracted to that. And it's something that they gift us with endlessly, it seems, until the very end.
Yep. So yeah, the dogs absolutely have this magical feature that they go from asleep to on a walk in 1 second. If you clap your hands and say, time to go out, anyone who has a dog knows that it doesn't matter how asleep they are, they're ready. And when you get home, it's like they meet you for the first time each time. And every time you go out and they find a ball in the woods, or another dog, some dogs like mine used to run away from other dogs, but they are excited and in the moment. And that's a very refreshing feature for humans, I think, all the time, but particularly in this overly processed, commoditized social media era where, I contrast what a dog does. They meet you, they run around with you, they play in that moment, to kind of the stereotypical picture of so many kids taking these selfies, and is the light right? Is the background right? Am I projecting this? Because they are not in the moment, they are in the future moment. And dogs teach us, that the exciting joy of life is something to live, not just to not. So I think that's one of the great gifts dogs give to us. The statement is, we don't deserve dogs, in the sense that they are always, super loving. They really bond, and they show you, even though without speaking, they show you how much it means. And as someone who's had a dog that just passed 2 days ago, after 13 and a half years of runs and treats and, coming to my office and, getting the pizza crusts from my students, you really see how much they can reflect the best part of us, being genuine, not being overly produced and perfumed and yeah. So I think that's one of the really critical things that we learn from dogs, and dogs give very generously.
Thanks for that, Dan. And sorry, of course, for Onyx's passing. And dogs don't live as long as we would like them to. That seems to be across
It's
the
true.
board. So, Dan, let's move into the environment, sustainability, the planet, where we're at, what families can do who are interested in this topic. What are the big steps? What are the small steps? What's happening around the globe from your vantage point? And really, if you would break it down in small bites so that it's digestible, because you work on a very large level, advising nations and other things like that. I'd love to hear some of your work in China, of course, and other things as well. But please share with us.
Well, that is one big topic, that is for sure. So I think that the good thing is that one can do things at the very local level, what you choose to eat or not to eat, and how you get engaged at one's school or one's community. All those things matter, all the way up to new research on climate change or local environmental challenges, the health of coral reefs. There's big macro things, but there's very micro things. So on the one hand, there's a real benefit that, by definition, literally the environment is all around us, and you can make a difference at all kinds of levels and stages of life and different social circles. So that's really the wonderful side of.
So give me some examples of food choices that you think are beneficial to the environment, or
So
steps
not
that.
everyone wants to hear it, but we now know incredibly clearly that our meat protein diet, in particular land meat, but we can get into ocean fish as well, is just simply not good for ourselves or for the planet. It might have been really good for us when we were hunter-gatherers, but in today's world, it is not good for us because of the way that we have forced livestock management on a very crowded planet that's losing biodiversity, that's losing open space, and it's a huge impact. So basically, after the choice of what energy you are consuming, and not everyone feels like they make that choice. Certainly, if you're living in inner city, or you feel very disconnected from your energy provider, it can seem really remote. But clean energy is one of the key things, and after that, it's basically your food, your diet choice, where you directly impact and receive benefits or harms by what you consume. And so, we're heading into the Thanksgiving season, and everyone will have to make their own peace with what they're going to eat just next week, and it's a very complicated choice. The global greenhouse gas story, at least 15%, and probably considerably more of our total impact on the planet, comes from our collective human food choices. And cows and pigs are the way we raise them. It's not a function. This is not criticizing the animal. The way we raise them and consume them and discard the remains dramatically impacts the planet on the global warming side, but also in terms of use of land and water. So those choices are critical, and everyone needs to kind of navigate that for themselves. In my own case, what it's meant, and this is far from a perfect choice, is that I try to be a vegetarian and a pescatarian. And of course, eating meat from the sea, fish, seafood, has some of the same damages as land-based meat. But when you look at the overall carbon footprint, we can talk about biodiversity in a bit, it's the land, it's the hoofed animal footprint that is the most critical, right? So eating meat with feet is a real challenge in this world, and it affects so much of our own health, biodiversity. Sounds like one is preaching, but that's one of the critical areas of decision making.
Dan,
Usually.
yes, that is definitely, but this conversation can be scary. It can be threatening. It can be, kids cannot understand it per se. Kids tend to love animals innately, so they might get it from that perspective. But so how does, as a dad and as someone who's a scientist, how do you have this conversation with your children or amongst your family, or in a way that feels empowering and inspiring and not shaming and wrong, like it's wrong what we do or wrong what those people do, or, et cetera, because a lot of people can get turned off by extreme dialogue that, you're wrong, you're destroying the planet, et cetera, et cetera.
So if we stay on the food theme, but there's lots of other themes here. There's water, there's energy, there's forests. But if just staying on the food theme for a second, because it's kind of visceral and it's immediate, one of the features is that I would say I learned much more from my kids than the other way around. I have two daughters. The youngest is a college senior, so they're largely out of the house. But what I learned from them as they went through different phases of vegetarianism, pescatarianism, we like to joke that you can be a pescatarian, you can be a vegetarian. If you only eat at night, you're a vampire. There's lots of different versions. But I learned from them because each time, and my kids went through several phases of many of these things, then we would have the chance to read about and study a little bit and see the impacts. We're now at an interesting point where this was not the thought process I had growing up. But when my kids became vegetarians, and they each became vegetarians and not several times, they got to that state. We learned about it. We learned about Supersize Me and the issues around fast food in particular, processed foods. My kids are back now to eating land meat because they've thought it through for themselves. Well, they took me into this, and my wife. I'm now the only one that remains in that category. So each one made their own path. So I would say I learned more from them than the reverse. But the interesting part was the learning. So the decisions can be a snap decision. Oh, I just saw an animal getting injured. I don't want to do that. Or, oh, it's okay. An animal that lives a free-range life, kind of the idyllic cow with a bell walking through the Sierra foothills or the rural areas of northern Kenya, that's as sustainable as a plant, right? So that's not about the animal. It's about the way that we raise them, the hormones that we inject them with, the inhumane ways we treat them. So those are all learning pieces where my kids
So what I'm hearing
my
you, so what I'm hearing you say here is, again, this is about the exploration. Everything is about this exploration and this discovery process. And maybe that's the deeper theme here, which is teach your kids to explore, support their being explorers. You yourself as a parent, be an explorer, and that will
be inquisitive but be willing to learn from what you learn, right? One of the challenges that we see in adults is that we are very comfortable in these so-called echo chambers, where the only news you get, the only people you interact with are very similar to you. And if we could teach our kids one thing, it comes back to your awe point. Part of awe is understanding or learning to understand how amazing things can be. But if you only walk in a very limited set of footsteps, you don't get all that. And so, yeah, exploring, but the awe feature is one that allows you to do something and learn from it.
So on that theme, thanks for bringing me back there. What is something, or what is the most amazing or awe-inspiring experience you've ever had in your life? And you've had so many because you've been all
I
over
do
the world.
feel that privilege plays a big role here because I've got
And
to see and do some things that I certainly didn't envision as a kid. I don't know if there's any single one. Well, that's a hard one to answer because there's so many different aspects. As a voyeur, not as a direct doer, because I didn't become an astronaut, I do think that one of the most amazing things is how different the world can be than what we see around us. And I'm thinking not just about the social side. Every time one of the human probes gets near Mars or Jupiter or Pluto, we learn amazing things. And you see worlds that are so different than our own that it opens up thinking, oh, we could do things very differently. We're now talking about, I mean, there's a whole field of what's called exoplanets and exobiology. We're now studying planets around other stars. And that field did not exist when I was a physics major, thinking, do I become an astronaut or maybe a professor of astrophysics or what I became, a professor of energy? So I think at one level, that is something that really inspires how differently one can do things and learn. I think that on a more immediate level, though, one of the really powerful kind of movements has been the degree that the sad part of climate change, the fires we see in California, the record 100-degree Fahrenheit days that we're experiencing in Siberia, fires that kill billions of animals in Australia. The immediacy and the connectivity to our world is something that is now all around us in some scary ways, but also some empowering ways. There was certainly a period of time when kind of the technological dominance over nature, and I wasn't around in the 1950s, but we often ascribe that period to kind of the massive growth of technology. Computing is rising, industrialization, building suburbs after World War II. There was a triumph over nature mentality, and whether we have that or not today, we shouldn't, but whether we do or not, we now have so much evidence how differently we need to treat nature, because how we treat nature reflects how we treat ourselves. And I think that's the other thing that comes out of my kind of everyday work that I get
would you
reminded
say
all the
that,
time.
would you say again, the access to privilege? Because I know for myself, so many of my awe experiences, and again, based on privilege, rafting down the Grand Canyon and being inside the Grand Canyon with amazing thunder and lightning storms, and being in Africa and seeing the most amazing night skies I've ever seen in my life and feeling like I could touch the stars. In reality, those are all experiences that change you forever because you've been given access to something that maybe you only dream of or
They're
don't
also
even know
privileged.
exist. So, so coming back to our audience and our parents, how, and you mentioned this complexity of the impact of these huge storms and et cetera, and how do parents talk to their children about these? Because they're scared. It's scary. It's overwhelming. There's a lot of climate change fear, so to speak, about the future of our species. How do parents speak about it from an awe perspective, even, and inspiring, like, hey, you can do this. Hey, maybe you can help figure out how we fix this or what we can do, or what are some ideas you have about parents helping their children and talking about these topics?
So I think the first thing is that while these kind of amazing experiences, being in the Serengeti or traveling in the Arctic, things like that are kind of visually stunning. They are largely a function of opportunity and privilege, but I don't think it needs to get there. I mean, I've had some of the most amazing conversations with, middle school and high school kids I taught in the local Oakland schools when we were out in, not even out in kind of quote unquote nature, but on the fringe of what they see every day. There's an amazing project in the Berkeley and Oakland schools called the Edible Schoolyard. And it's about empowering kids to grow their own food. There's both an economic opportunity benefit, but there's an understanding the connection to nature side. And I think those are the experiences that can really shape and reflect the degree to which we are part of nature, not apart from nature. And it's not that you preserve the environment because it's something to keep at arm's length and we should preserve it because we should. That's true, but there's a much more immediate feedback. And I think that's one of the areas where parents, in all kinds of mundane decisions, you're in the grocery store with your kids and you say, oh, these are two products. Let's look at where they come from. And today it's actually usually written on the side of the container. And if not on the container, there are apps where you scan that QR code and it says, this product is made with palm oil derived from the rainforest. This product is locally manufactured. The challenge is that we tend to make the product that's better for the planet and better for us more expensive, which means you come back to this privilege and affluence. But it's not always the case. And so I think that seeing the world around you, whether it's the built, very urban world, the suburban world, the more rural world around you through a lens of steward, custodian, and beneficiary all at the same time. I think that's an area where parenting at any level, or big brothering or big sistering, or whatever you want to say, is that meaningful piece. All of those feed into an understanding and appreciation of the world around us, and not just the natural world, because part of it is the choices I make open up opportunities for other people, whether it's other countries, whether it's less advantaged, but that connectivity is something that, some early naturalists wrote about, but we're going to need to get back to. And kids, like dogs, are able to kind of live in the moment. And if they appreciate that immediate opportunity, they can run with it. And I think that's something that everyone who nurtures a young person can help to do in critical ways.
That's fantastic. Now, final question for you, Dan. Are we going to live on Mars one day?
Well, I mean, certainly at some point we are, and I don't mean individual rich trillionaires. I mean, eventually humans will be in many places. And that's because despite all of the environmental doom and gloom, I do think we're going to make it. My worry is that we're going to make it and only reward a few with making it. The real challenge is, how do we make it and bring the benefits to all? So whether we're going to live on the moon or Mars or Titan, moons of Saturn and Jupiter, I think the answer is yes for all of these. One of the big questions is the biggest thing we take with us this seemingly overwhelming ability of humans to destroy the environment they live in, or is the lesson we're going to take from having degraded the Earth so much, but hopefully helping it to recover, that we are going to make better choices in our next venues? And I think that's the really critical feature. No question that the ability to set up productive colonies or settlements, whatever you want to call it, on the moon, Mars, on Titan, Ganymede, all kinds of places are certainly possible. We have shown one very, very poor path to being stewards of this planet. And let's hope that, again, in repairing this one, we do a better job where we get to next.
Got it. All right. Well, that's why we're here. But so we've been doing this with each other for a long time. So onwards and upwards, and we will continue to do our parts of the puzzle and see where we can help. One last thing, you didn't say anything about China. I'd love to hear I know the Chinese are very much driving certain initiatives on sustainability, and you've been involved with that. Can you just say a few words about the work in China?
Yeah, so let me say about China, but I want to bring Africa in co-equally to that.
Okay.
China is this huge experiment in managing 1.25 billion people under one centralized system. It gets a bad rap in some ways, and it gets a good rap in some ways. And on the climate side, China is kind of teaching us about excess, in the sense of China is both the biggest producers of clean energy technologies, solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicles, and they are the biggest installer of coal power plants that are literally choking us to death. So China is running in all directions amazingly fast. That's both an inspiring and a scary lesson all at once. And much of the raw materials for the clean energy future that we know we need but may not want to embrace have roots in Africa. And so when we look at so many of the materials in our cell phones and solar panels, it's the cobalt, 70% of which comes from the Congo today. It is what we see in Kenya, where over 95% of energy comes from clean sources. And so while China teaches us about scale and industrialization and about managing resources for a massive population, Africa and China in Africa and Africa and China and the US in Africa and China all teach us about these are interconnected. So in my own case, I work very closely with 5 different Chinese universities. In fact, I was in China earlier this month, and I'll be in China in 2 weeks. So a very deep dialogue with some amazing colleagues, training amazing young people. But we all know that our human footprint on the planet's going to have to change dramatically, not just our diets, but our diets for metals. We're going to need to create whole new curriculums about recycling and about respecting nature. And that's something that we in the West, I'll call it, have things to learn from China. China has things to learn from us. And we in the US have a great deal to learn from Africa in terms of understanding and managing those resources. And I think it's that global 3-way. There's other critical places too, but in my own case, Africa, China, and the US are the 3 where I see so much that we've got to do much more collaboratively. And I think that's really the story of environmental issues. Inspire and teach, but recognize that our choices have real immediate implications, good and bad.
Thank you, Dan. I think that's a good note to leave on here. And perhaps we can have you back and talk about some more of this.
Happy to come back.
Always good to see you. Good to talk to you. Thank you for your tireless work for us and this planet. Keep shaping those minds and those
or learning from those minds, I would say.
Hearts and minds. And so have a wonderful day and thanks so much.
Thank you. You too.